So it's my great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Nicola Carboni, who's from the Digital Humanities Laboratory of the University of Geneva. Nicola will talk to us today on an ontology for this description of visual heritage. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen and I hope everything will be all right. And seems like it. Okay, yes, it's, as you may see from the title, I'm here to talk about ontologies and specifically about visual heritage. And before diving into an ontology for a description of visual heritage, I would like to maybe spend a few words of why this has been created, why it's been useful for me. So it all started with a project. It's a documentation project of a small Byzantine foundation in Cyprus, in the Troodos Mountain. As you may see already from these images, the church is fully draped during several campaigns, actually, that start during the Byzantine period, then afterward, during the Frankish and the Venetian one. So they are testimony of very diverse influence on the church. And my approach was to try to find something that would somehow reflect the richness in both composition, the figurative richness, but also the special richness of the church. And initially, of course, using digital methods. And the initial part was to use a photographic campaign, which I then transformed into a photogrammetric 3D model in order to give account of the church in itself and how is composed, decomposed, redrape, and trying to give the diverse spatiality and unity of the panel, because of the lack of space, the several artists that drape the church had to find some compromise. Certain panels are in different positions, but they are part of the same unity. However, this was not fully satisfying. I wanted to try to find a way to explore more about it, which is not done only through photograph or not done only through 3D model. I wanted to try to find a glue that would allow me to describe such richness in images, the content of the images, and link it with the photo I've taken and the 3D model I constructed. Something, however, that would also allow me to interconnect with current knowledge that we have, and therefore, and also expand it on other church in the area. This is part of a bigger unity, which is the UNESCO site of the Troodos Mountain, which is a region with small Byzantine foundation, with very rich in painting. And that solution was somehow quite close to my heart. I was trying to find a way to link in this information and data, and the solution is indeed in linked data. So why this approach? Well, it allows us to integrate things, but how to do so? How to provide such richness, how to describe it, and how to make it available. Well, that became quite a bit more complicated, if you know the field, specifically in semantic, you probably may have heard the term CIDOC-CRM. So how to describe this information when using, of course, an ontology. For a system to give meaning to the information we have, a shared layer where we can use to take our information, put them together and share them with the world, but also integrate information that are somewhere else. And I start analyzing CIDOC-CRM, starting to try to find what is actually there in respect to the visual. And unfortunately, at the very beginning, not very much. There is something, but the CIDOC-CRM comes from a background of museum information, museum catalog. Therefore, not much has been done in respect to the subject of the image. Therefore, but a lot still the system is pretty good. As you know, it's a ISO standard, it's an event based. Therefore, it allows us to put information in time and space and track them in time and space, is widely adopted, is very flexible, and that's also very nice. And there are already some extension for covering several different cases, such as archaeology, but also digital representation. So something that could be very much useful for my case if I wanted to have information about 3D model, but also information about the church itself, how it came to be, when things were done, and where it is, because also its position is quite important. It's in the mountain, but we saw very briefly as some influence from the Frankish and also the Venetian domination of the island. So they arrive until the core of the island in itself. And I decided to expand on this to try to find a further way to take and transform information about the visual using CIDOC-CRM, and there where the visual representation ontology came into being. You probably may have heard about CIDOC-CRM, and you probably may already have an idea that is a very difficult and very large ontology with the 200-page of documentation, which is more or less the case. So I wanted to try to find something that was a bit smaller, and also reusing property in class of CIDOC-CRM, I just created a very basic set. A very basic set that would allow us to define diverse level of representation, which are not prescribed by the ontology, but they are actually given by the user, because we all describe things differently. We all have different unity of description when we look at the visual, and depending on our knowledge, our background. And therefore, I didn't want to prescribe that, and that is why it's small. However, small does not mean that nothing can be done. It's the combination of this property in class can allow already to go quite a bit further than what we have now. Specifically, it's important to say that this has been made in order to use very basic pattern. We already have some in CIDOC-CRM, some idea how to represent the physical world, and the idea is to implement new pattern about representation, such as something as a representation, or a representation as some characteristic, whatever those characteristics we may define important for us, and those characteristics can symbolize something, but also the representation can symbolize something, or they can illustrate something else. There are very diverse combinations of using this pattern. But the main idea behind, and see the most at least important close to my heart, is try to find a way to define part of the representation and to ground them in time and see how it does change. So I use the example of St. George, both because it's a panel within the church, a very important one, the one here on the right, but it's also a very good example. The representation of St. George has changed through time very much, with different attributes, a very different representation with different elements. Those elements can come together, can be specific of a certain place, or it can change, of course, through time. The usual representation of St. George, as we may have in mind now with the dragon, for example, and the princess, came at a certain point in history and then became the most prominent one, but depends on where there were also other type of representation of St. George that were living in parallel. So the idea is trying to find how this element can go together, and how we can track their movement, the circulation, how we can see the evolution of the representation. It's also important to say that those elements are not only typical of one representation. St. George is not the only one fighting dragons. Many saints fight dragons, and if we take out a usual Christian art outlook, other figures and other fight dragons, indeed on horse. So the idea is trying to find this core and how to try to track this thing over time, and how to put them in relation with a representation, how to find this information. And I start to do so actually thinking about the church, starting from one single part of the church, the South Lunette, then in the narthex. So really the idea is to take one small part and see already the richness that such small part can have, and what we can take out, how this can actually link to the other internal part of the church that refer to it, but also to the external part, the area in the Troodos Mountains, where certain elements are common, as well as a larger area. For example, there's some elements which are coming and are influenced by the Frankish domination, for example. So this is just to give you an idea of the graph of what can be done. If you know CIDOC-CRM, we can already do something with it. We can see how things are produced, but what was important to me is what things are denoted and what things are portrayed. Sometimes we classify something as just St. George, but St. George does not mean very much. St. George is a character that is being portrayed. Therefore, we define the differentiation between the character that is being portrayed and the features that are relevant to that character in the representation that we define ourselves. And how to link those, for example, to common known vocabulary in order to link with known sources and then integrate with other data. So for example, in our case, icon class, but we could also use a very different classification and vocabulary, such as the Warburg one, for example. There are also something else that we can say except that, and that's well, very much, but time is limited. For sure, what is important, what I wanted to do and say that certain elements we do recognize, they symbolize something. They depict something, and that they have an important symbolic role within the representation. So the panel of Santa Anastasia Samarina are an example where Santa Anastasia is, of course, some of the typical attribute of the saints, such as Battle of Medicine, which symbolize healing at this time. But the symbols are not fixed. Also important to say that as much as representation, depending on the context, they can symbolize something else. In rural Cyprus, for example, St. George on a horse also symbolize the countryside, which is not typical in certain other representation. We have also, as I was mentioning, the certain part, this is the panel of the Virgin of Mercy, which are definitely influenced by the domination of the island. And in this case, we know that mostly because there is a Latin donor, which is depicted. And we can define a part of the representation and how this part of the representation has some attribute and this. So for example, the cotton, how this have a country of origin, as well as more attribute and more information such as is influenced as a representation by the Byzantine period, exactly the Frankish domination of the island. Well, we can go a step further and also link not only on the element of the representation and how history influenced them, but also how the performance and the rite within the church in itself can influence. So is the case, for example, of the collective torment, which is also part of this West Lunette, and which are cited by the hymnarium, which were used at the time for the mid-first Sunday rite. So we do have some in the hymnarium, some reference to the figure of the gnashes of the teeth, but also to the figure in general of the collective torment. And we can take this fragment of text and say that this illustrates a specific representation which was happening in the church in a specific spot. And this we can do somehow with this small, very small pattern. Now, after having defined, I also added to research space, which is a great project for the one who don't know, which is allowed to use semantic web data in a very easy manner. And here I start already to create a knowledge map of this information in order to give an idea of the richness that we can see in the south lunette of the church. And I'm going to go a bit further, and now we can actually link, retrieve dynamically this semantic information together, thanks to actually the ontology, both CIDOC-CRM and VIR, and the visual representation one. And we can actually, taking the example, here we are exploring the attribute, but taking the example of Anastasia Maralina, we can see how certain part of the depiction are found in other churches, as much as, I go a bit further, as another representation in other churches, and how this can also be found and retrieved in not only in the Troodos area, but are part of a general fashion, which can be tracked to France. If I remember correctly, here we arrive until the Église de Cordeliers de Nancy. And we can do the same thing, and yes, we can do the same thing for the representation of St. George, as I was mentioning before, and find the attributes which are shared by your representation, and also the attributes which are not. And all doing this dynamically thanks to the semantic data that are encoded with this ontology. But we are running very low on time. I just want to conclude giving you an idea of the possibility of what can be done. And first of all, it's great in order to share information about the iconographical content of a representation. But also it gives the possibility to define your level of description, not a prescribed one. What is the representation? What is part of the representation can be a multitude. It depends very much on your need. You can go further or just stay on a very initial level, as much as define the attributes that are relevant for you. Therefore, is an agnostic model. And that also helps to link to diverse sources and vocabulary. And but it's important to state in this overall discussion that this is not generative. When we talk about this kind of method, we have information. This information are coming from my own research, which are encoded and made available, taking out a link with other information, such as from Wikidata, where we can take some icon class code already available and link them together, but we are not generating one. For generation of information, we need to look at computer vision. And well, that is available and documented at this website. And thank you very much.